King Edward II, mid-reign, 1311 to 1321. The death of Piers Gaveston and the escalation of conflict. Throughout the early 1310s, tensions between King Edward II and the English barons remained at a boiling point. The discontent among the nobility, particularly regarding Edward's unwavering favouritism towards Piers Gaveston, had led to the imposition of the Ordinances in 1311, an attempt by the barons to curb royal authority and exile Gaveston permanently. However, Edward, unwilling to accept these constraints on his power, soon defied the barons by recalling his beloved companion from exile. This decision would prove to be a pivotal moment in the growing crisis of his reign. At the heart of the opposition was Edward's formidable cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. As one of the most powerful nobles in England, Lancaster held the titles of Earl of Leicester, Lincoln, Salisbury, and Derby, commanding an immense annual income of approximately £11,000, nearly double that of any other noble. His considerable wealth and influence allowed him to lead a powerful baronial faction, which included the Earls of Arundel, Gloucester, Hereford, Pembroke, and Warwick. However, while Lancaster was a significant political figure, he lacked the strategic acumen and administrative skill necessary to consolidate his influence effectively. His leadership was more reactionary than visionary, driven by personal grievances rather than a coherent plan for governance. Edward's decision to revoke the ordinances and recall Gaveston in January 1312 enraged the barons, who viewed it as a direct challenge to their authority. The Archbishop of Canterbury swiftly excommunicated Gaveston, a severe spiritual punishment that further isolated him politically. In response, the barons convened in London to discuss their next course of action. Recognizing the risk of Gaveston seeking refuge in Scotland, they formulated a plan to capture him before he could escape. As tensions mounted, Edward, Queen Isabella, and Gaveston fled northward to Newcastle, seeking safety. However, they were relentlessly pursued by Lancaster and his allies, forcing them to make a desperate escape. Abandoning many of their belongings, the royal party fled by sea and landed at Scarborough, where Gaveston took refuge in the castle while Edward and Isabella made their way back to York. The king hoped to rally support and mount a defence, but Gaveston's situation soon became untenable. Capture and execution of Gaveston. Recognizing that resistance was futile, Gaveston surrendered to the Earls of Pembroke and Surrey under the assurance that his life would be spared. When he was taken into custody, he was found to be in possession of a vast collection of gold, silver, and jewels, raising suspicions that he had plundered the royal treasury. While these accusations may have been exaggerated, they provided further justification for his enemies to act against him. On the journey south, Gaveston was temporarily housed in Dedington, Oxfordshire, under the guard of the Earl of Pembroke, who, at the time, left to visit his wife. Seizing this moment of vulnerability, Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, took it upon himself to abduct Gaveston. Warwick, who bore a deep personal hatred for Edward's favourite, forcibly removed him from Dedington and transported him to Warwick Castle. By the 18th of June, 1312, Lancaster and his faction convened at Warwick Castle to determine Gaveston's fate. A swift and informal trial was held, where he was declared a traitor under the provisions of the ordinances. The barons, acting without royal sanction, had no legal authority to execute Gaveston, yet they proceeded regardless. The next day, on the 19th of June, Gaveston was taken to Blacklow Hill, a desolate location outside Warwick, and summarily beheaded on Lancaster's orders. His body was left unburied for 3 years, a grim testament to the hatred his enemies bore him. It was not until 1315 that he was finally laid to rest at King's Langley Priory, where Edward later built a lavish tomb for his fallen companion. Aftermath and escalating conflict. Gaveston's brutal execution deepened the animosity between Edward and the nobility. The king was devastated by the loss of his closest confidant, and though he was powerless to act immediately, he never forgave Lancaster and his allies for what he saw as a blatant act of treason. The rift between the monarchy and the barons widened, setting the stage for further civil unrest and armed conflicts that would define the remainder of Edward's troubled reign. The repercussions of Gaveston's death extended beyond mere personal grief. Edward became increasingly determined to reassert his authority, leading to a series of escalating confrontations with the baronial factions. His marriage to Queen Isabella, initially a source of political stability, also began to suffer as tensions mounted. Isabella, while loyal to Edward in his early reign, grew frustrated with his inability to govern effectively and his ongoing reliance on court favorites. As political instability deepened, she would eventually play a critical role in Edward's downfall. Meanwhile, Lancaster and his faction continued to consolidate their power, acting as the de facto rulers of England, yet their own internal divisions prevented them from forming a truly unified front. In many ways, Lancaster's opposition to Edward was more about personal vengeance than a strategic plan to improve governance. His failure to provide effective leadership left England in a state of political paralysis, further exacerbating tensions that would soon erupt into open warfare. Edward, despite his grief, sought allies both domestically and abroad. His efforts to negotiate with France and the papacy demonstrated his desperation to regain control. However, his reliance on another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, further alienated the nobility. The rise of the Despenser family would lead to another intense struggle between Edward and the barons, culminating in the Despenser War, 1321 to 1322. Ultimately, Gaveston's death marked not the resolution of England's political strife, but rather the beginning of a more violent and prolonged struggle for power. With Edward seeking vengeance and Lancaster consolidating his influence, England was soon to be engulfed in deeper turmoil, one that would ultimately shape the trajectory of the entire kingdom. The unresolved tensions, personal rivalries, and shifting alliances of this period would pave the way for the rebellion, war, and eventual deposition of Edward II in the years to come. Tensions with Lancaster and France. Reactions to the execution of Piers Gaveston were deeply divided. King Edward II was both enraged and heartbroken over what he perceived as a treacherous murder of his dearest companion. His grief soon turned into a relentless drive for vengeance. Edward made immediate provisions for Gaveston's widow and child, ensuring their financial security, and openly declared his intent to punish those responsible for his friend's death. The execution had only deepened Edward's determination to reassert his authority and challenge the baronial factions who had defied him. Among the nobility, the aftermath of Gaveston's death was tumultuous. The Earls of Pembroke and Surrey, initially part of the opposition to Gaveston, were deeply unsettled by the manner of his execution. They viewed Warwick's unilateral decision to kill Gaveston without a formal trial as both dishonorable and a dangerous precedent, as it challenged the very notion of due process in noble disputes. These concerns prompted Pembroke and Surrey to shift their allegiance to Edward, offering him a crucial opportunity to regain lost ground. However, the Earl of Lancaster and his faction, which included Warwick, Hereford, and Arundel, remained resolute in their belief that Gaveston's execution had been justified. They defended their actions as necessary to uphold the ordinances and maintain the stability of the realm, seeing Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston as a threat to England's governance. Tensions between Edward and Lancaster escalated to the brink of civil war, as each side began mobilizing forces. However, diplomacy prevented immediate conflict. By December 1312, the Earl of Pembroke negotiated a peace treaty between Edward and the rebellious barons. The proposed agreement would pardon the nobles involved in Gaveston's execution in exchange for their renewed loyalty and participation in a fresh campaign against Scotland. Lancaster and Warwick, however, refused to immediately approve the agreement, prolonging tensions through most of 1313. The prolonged stalemate left England in a fragile state, with an uneasy truce keeping outright conflict at bay. Diplomatic maneuvers with France. While England remained divided internally, Edward sought to strengthen his position internationally. He turned his attention to England's strained relationship with France, where disputes over the governance of Gascony, a valuable English territory in the south of France, had long remained unresolved. Seeking to negotiate a settlement and secure diplomatic support, Pembroke led negotiations with the French crown, aiming to diffuse tensions. As part of this effort, Edward and Queen Isabella travelled to Paris in June 1313 to meet with Philip IV of France, Isabella's father. Edward viewed this diplomatic mission as an opportunity to secure favourable terms in Gascony, but he also hoped to gain Philip's support in his struggle against the rebellious barons. Meanwhile, Philip IV saw the visit as a chance to demonstrate his grandeur, reinforcing his image as one of Europe's most powerful rulers and reminding Edward of France's superior wealth and influence. The visit to Paris turned into a lavish and politically significant event. The highlight was a grand knighting ceremony at Notre Dame de Paris, where Edward and Philip jointly knighted Philip's sons and over 200 noblemen. Elaborate banquets along the River Seine, opulent feasts, and an oath to embark on a joint crusade to the Levant reinforced the bond between the two monarchs. While the promise of a crusade was largely symbolic, the negotiations proved fruitful. Philip granted lenient terms for resolving the disputes in Gascony, offering Edward a much-needed diplomatic victory. The visit was marred only by an accidental fire in Edward's quarters, which caused substantial damage but did little to dampen the overall success of the mission. Strengthening Edward's position. Edward's return from France in late 1313 marked a turning point. His newfound diplomatic successes bolstered his standing, and the loyalty of Pembroke and Surrey provided him with additional political leverage. Determined to consolidate his authority, Edward intensified negotiations with Lancaster and Warwick, urging them to accept a compromise. By October 1313, an agreement was finally reached, closely resembling the December 1312 peace treaty. A critical factor in Edward's strengthened position was the dramatic recovery of royal finances. For the first time in his reign, Edward's government was financially secure, owing to several key financial initiatives. Parliament approved new taxation measures, while Edward secured a loan of 160,000 florins, £25,000, from the Pope and an additional £33,000 from Philip IV. Furthermore, his alliance with the Italian banker Antonio Pisano ensured a steady flow of credit, allowing Edward to fund both his court and military campaigns more effectively than before. This financial stability granted him the resources necessary to strengthen his administration and prepare for future conflicts. Growing struggles and future conflicts. Though Edward's immediate position had improved, the underlying tensions between the monarchy and Lancaster's faction had not disappeared. The baronial opposition had been momentarily pacified, but deep-seated grievances persisted. Lancaster, Warwick, and their allies continued to view Edward's reliance on personal favourites with suspicion, fearing that he would soon elevate another royal companion in the mould of Gaveston. Their concerns proved to be well-founded. By 1315, Edward began favouring a new courtier, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser's rapid rise to prominence caused fresh outrage among the nobility, as he quickly became the king's closest advisor and confidant. Many barons, particularly Lancaster, saw Despenser as an even greater threat than Gaveston, fearing that his influence over Edward would lead to even greater corruption and misgovernance. As Edward entered the later years of his reign, the delicate truce between the monarchy and the nobility began to crumble once more. The growing dominance of Despenser and his family provoked widespread resentment, leading to renewed hostilities between Edward and his baronial opponents. The fragile peace achieved in 1313 could not withstand the mounting tensions, and by 1321, England was once again on the verge of civil war. The conflict that followed, known as the Despenser War, 1321 to 1322, saw Lancaster and his allies rise against Edward in open rebellion. The king, now better funded and politically more experienced, launched a vigorous response. Unlike in previous conflicts, Edward successfully crushed the rebellion, ultimately capturing and executing Lancaster in 1322. This decisive action temporarily secured Edward's rule, but it also further alienated many nobles, deepening the crisis of his reign. Edward's turbulent relationship with his barons, his financial maneuvering, and his diplomatic efforts with France all shaped this volatile period of English history. The Despencer War and the subsequent fallout paved the way for Edward's eventual downfall, as resentment against his rule continued to grow. By 1326, the seeds of rebellion planted during these years would culminate in his deposition and imprisonment, bringing his troubled reign to a dramatic and ignominious end. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.